Greetings. I'm Dr. Frank Bremer. I'm a member of the board of the Congregational Library and Archives, and this is one of a series in our history talks. On this occasion, we're going to be having another member of the library board, Adrienne Weimer, Associate Professor of History at Providence College, author herself of Martyr's Mirror, Persecution and Holiness in Early New England. And she is going to be talking to Dr. Erik Seeman, a professor of history at the University of Buffalo. Erik specializes in the history of colonial North America, religion, and death practices. He's the author of 4 books, including Death in the New World, Cross-Cultural Encounters, 1492 to 1800, and most recently, Speaking with the Dead in Early America, which won the 2020 Lawrence W. Levine Award for the best book in American cultural history, awarded by the Organization of American Historians. And that's the book that Adrienne is going to be discussing with him today. So Adrienne, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Frank, and thank you, Erik, for agreeing to be with us today. We're so excited to discuss this book, and I'll launch right into it. I think one of the most remarkable things about Speaking with the Dead is the range of sources that it draws on, from gravestones to diaries to literature to portraits. And I wonder if you would speak to us a little bit about when you were first starting this project, how you developed an interest in the topic, and how you had an inkling there might be so much source material for this topic, and maybe even a little bit about how you went about finding the source material.
Thanks, Adrienne. That's a great question. And I'll just thank Frank as well for inviting me to do this talk. Any author is always eager to talk about his or her work. So this is a great opportunity for me. So where the book came from, it actually emerged from my teaching. I teach a big lecture class called Death in America every 2 or 3 years, as often as I can, squeeze it into my schedule. When I first proposed that class 20 years ago, my chair said, kids aren't interested in death. They're not going to want to go to this class, but it always fills up to 100 or 150 students. They're quite interested. And one of the topics that they find most interesting is spiritualism after 1848 and the Fox sisters and that movement of seances and communication with the dead. And so I've taught that from the beginning of this class. And one of the questions that always emerged from my students and from myself was how spiritualism became so popular so quickly. By the end of the 1850s, really within just a decade of its founding, spiritualism was claiming millions of adherents. It's probably hundreds of thousands of spiritualists by the end of the 1850s, but millions was not that extraordinary of a claim or that extravagant of a claim. So that was the question I started with. Where did spiritualism come from? Where did this idea that people could communicate with the dead come from? So I started looking at sources, as you've noted, and from the beginning of my career, I've really considered myself a social historian. I'm interested in finding the words and thoughts of, what are sometimes called ordinary people. I don't really like that very much. Maybe we'll say non-elites, people who, aren't leaving behind sheafs of papers and laws and things like that. So I started to look in places that I thought would allow me access to a broader range of individuals. So sources like parlor songs, which are the kind of songs that people would gather in their parlor, and maybe someone would have a newfangled piano, or maybe they would just, sing along without musical accompaniment. Funeral hymns, sentimental poetry that was so popular really among all literate Americans in the 19th century, but especially among women, and especially in the women's magazines that had such enormous circulation, like Godey's Ladies Book, which was the magazine in the 19th century with the greatest circulation in the middle of the 19th century. So that's where I started looking for broader evidence of interest in communication with the dead. And so from the beginning, I was defining communication with the dead more broadly than just in seances and that kind of really a direct vocalization of speaking with the dead, but more broadly in terms of people trying to maintain or continue relationships with the dead by imagining them and by imagining that kind of interaction between them. So I started finding evidence of that in 19th century sources. And so I decided to just go back further in time. And in the 18th century, I looked at newspapers. I looked at gravestones. Gravestone epitaphs are a great source at getting at people who leave no other written sources behind other than the epitaph on their gravestone. Took it back into the 17th century and found evidence of interest in communication with the dead in witchcraft trials, and Puritan elegies. And so it really became, as you say, just a whole range of sources, but always my goal was to try to get at those people who are often left out of the story of early American Protestantism, or whose words are just harder to access.
Terrific. You mentioned looking especially at sources that were produced by or about or in the circles of women. And I wonder if you would speak more to that. Your book is very attentive to the gendered nature of religious practice and thought and expression. And I wonder if there's something you might say more broadly about, especially Congregationalist women, if you found things that might change the way we think about those women in their lives.
Yeah, that was kind of a surprise to me, how the book became essentially a history of women's religious practice in large part, especially the last two chapters where I outline the beliefs and practices of what I call the cult of the dead, which was, there were origins of that earlier, but really in the late 18th and 19th century, there's just so much interest in maintaining relationships with the dead. People believe that the souls of the dead can return as guardian angels. They believe that that individuals can go to graveyards and commune with the spirits of the dead, and those ideas coalesce in a way in, like I said, the late 18th, early 19th century to form what I call a cult of the dead, and women are absolutely central to that. I mean, I knew that women made up the majority of spiritualist mediums, and women in many places and times throughout history have been seen as having a kind of more direct conduit to the spirit world. So it wasn't entirely surprising, but really it wasn't what I had set out to do. It's just that in women's diaries and spiritual journals is where I found the most direct and most powerful evidence of Protestants maintaining connections with the dead. So one of the things I think this tells us about, I think at the broadest level, what this tells us about Congregational women in the 19th century is the extent to which women were shaping their religion. So if in histories of Congregationalism in the first part of the 19th century, where it's really talking about men, ministers, male theologians, and the controversy with Unitarians and the split there, and the ideas about Calvinism and whether people are going to move beyond Calvinism, or how Calvinism is changing at that time, which are all, of course, important questions for how people experience their religion in that period. But for many Congregationalists, those kinds of theological questions were more abstract than would have been of greatest interest to them. And what was more pressing to them, to many lay Congregationalists, was their relationship with their loved ones, and then what happens when their loved ones die, and what does heaven look like? And will I meet my loved one there? And can I maintain a relationship while I'm on earth? So, so women were really central in shaping these ideas about that there was more possibility for maintaining relationships with the deceased than they would have heard from the pulpit.
That makes a lot of sense, and these are exciting findings. I think there's tremendous opportunities there for rethinking these broader narratives and rethinking women's contributions. And Frank, I know this is work that you're involved in as well, thinking about lay women's contributions. You mentioned the 19th century, and I want to make sure we get to discuss some of the early period as well. I have to say, Erik, you're one of a handful of scholars I've read recently who are as comfortable in the 17th as in the 19th century and have this range in your expertise that you can go back and forth. So I wanted to talk about Cotton Mather, a major figure, of course, in the history of Congregationalism, often misunderstood figure. And you portray him differently than I've seen. You have a beautiful description of him watching his father, Increase Mather, on his deathbed, and then writing Celestinus, A Conversation in Heaven. And over time, you argue that he became a person who most enthusiastically encouraged lay people to interact with the dead. So why do you think Mather went in this direction, and how influential were his works on later Protestants?
That's a great question. And yeah, I mean, you know this, that Cotton Mather hasn't fared well in the popular or historical imagination. And he was constantly hectoring his parishioners to behave better, and that it kind of grates on the modern ear. Obviously, he was very involved in the Salem witch trials, where 20 people were executed. So that doesn't sit very well with people today. But I think that there's a way in which his interest in death and heaven humanizes him. At least it did for me as I was doing this research. So Increase Mather dies a very difficult death in 1723, and it's one of the difficulties that Cotton Mather has to deal with is explaining to people that you can have a bad death, a very difficult, painful death, and still be destined to go to heaven. That's not indicative, even though in the kind of popular imagination, there had been a kind of connection between how difficult a person's death was and how likely it was that that person might be going to heaven. So he has that to deal with. At the same time, he's trying to, assume his place now as the leading minister of Boston after his father dies. Kind of, he's been in waiting for his whole life at this point. And so in the 1720s, he really starts thinking a lot more about heaven, what it looks like. He's always been interested in heaven. This is not new, but in his ideas about this, the possibility of what he calls conversation with the departed, I think he takes a new turn in that decade as he's awaiting his father's death and after his father's death, in urging parishioners to have that conversation with the departed. He tells people that if you're feeling lukewarm in your practice, if you feel like your religion isn't up to the level that you wish it to be, he says, call down from heaven are the departed faithful. And by that, he doesn't mean the way a spiritualist would in the 1850s, to actually imagine that person's soul has kind of flown down, is in the room next to you. But he imagines a mental, what they called in the 17th and 18th century, converse or conversation, meaning intercourse or interaction with the dead. So call down the departed faithful and have them help you through this spiritual crisis that you might be going through. I think he's kind of channeling his own, concerns and maybe spiritual doubts or questions that he had after his father died. And so he's recommending to people to maintain that relationship with the dead, have that conversation with the departed, and it'll keep your faith lively.
Well, and it's fascinating to see how that emerges from an older meditative tradition that in some ways goes all the way back to the early years of the Protestant Reformation in England. And then, you know, this tradition of meditating on heaven, you know, emerges in the 1670s, but then Mather, you know, develops it in this really interesting and in some ways unique ways. Do you think that Mather's ideas and emphasis led to some of the later emphasis on conversation with the dead, and taking that broadly as you do? Or do you think the strain of Matherian, how do we say it, Matherian piety went in different directions?
That's a great question. I really don't know. I will say that I don't see later ministers quoting Mather. You know, so I found his Celestinus from 1723 to be really powerful. The subtitle is A Conversation in Heaven, and he ventriloquizes his father. He imagines what Increase Mather would be saying from heaven if we could hear him. But I don't read in subsequent Protestant ministers them saying, you know, as Cotton Mather wrote in the 1720s, can you imagine? So I don't see a direct line, and it's running maybe on parallel tracks with the lay women who are having some of the same interests in maintaining those connections with the dead, but not necessarily getting it from having read Mather's, you know, printed sermons. So I think the influence question, I think would have, for me at this moment, would have to remain a question mark. And maybe there's a really dogged PhD student out there who would try to trace down these, you know, through libraries or things like that, see who was reading Mather's late works on heaven, and was that influential at all?
Be a great project. And I know it's interesting, even somebody like Jonathan Edwards and his Heaven, what is it? Heaven is a World of Love, where he imagines heaven and imagines the kind of work that heavenly beings are doing to create good. There's no quotation from Mather there. There's not the kind of direct line that you know could have been there, but wasn't. So it'd be an interesting question to pursue.
Yeah.
The images in your book are so striking, and you do a great deal both theoretically and interpretively with objects and images, gravestone portraits, many other kinds of images. And I was particularly interested in the cover image, which I hope our viewers can see. Would you unpack this image for us and tell us what it says about change over time in American Protestantism, or how people understood their relationship with the dead?
Sure. So it's a mourning brooch dated to 1789. It's held by the Yale University Art Galleries, and they very generously don't claim copyright to the image. So I was able to just download it from the website and send it to the press. It's actually a tiny little piece. It's not tiny, it's an inch long. And so that's massively blown up, that picture. But they provided such a nice high res image of it that we were able to get that. And what you can see is it's the daughter, the 19-year-old daughter, S.C. Washington. We have only her initials, her first initials. And she's bursting forth from the grave. And you can see those two little pieces of ivory beneath her that are sort of look like they've been broken out of the obelisk from which she's emerging. The artist has put those there to give a sense of just how vigorously she is emerging from the grave. I really should say her soul, but there's slippage there. I mean, she doesn't really look like a soul. She just looks like a human. And her mother is standing there with her hands clasped together, and she's just enraptured that she is able to witness her daughter's soul emerging from the grave. What the viewers today can't see very well is at the very bottom of the stone, there's sort of like a furry texture. And what that is chopped hair. So the artist incorporated the 19-year-old girl's own hair into the paint that he used to paint the bottom of that picture. So her hair is there. It sort of looks like a little kind of grassy kind of area in front of the grave. So the mother who was wearing this mourning brooch had little tiny pieces of her daughter's actual body up against her bosom, and this image of her daughter or her daughter's soul emerging from the grave. And so what it tells me is that people saw graveyards as places where they could have an intense encounter with the soul of the dead. It tells me that mothers were very much interested in maintaining a relationship with their deceased children, with their deceased loved ones. And it tells me that there was a possibility of communication. These two characters they're connected. There's a connection between them. And in that graveyard, in this representation of the graveyard, there's communication between them, or what I call a little bit provocatively speaking with the dead. I mean, that she's not necessarily speaking this, vocalizing it, but she's imagining this continued connection with her daughter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that connection is palpable. I mean, the image is a powerful one. You can see the relationship that's being imagined here, or being that they're participating in.
And so some of the other sources, some of the other material sources that I use were really supplemented by written sources as well. And so we're able to understand them better. So mourning portraiture, for example, I mean, historians have known, of course, forever that mourning portraiture was very popular in early 19th century America, and that people would, especially if their children died, upper middle class people would very commonly, especially in the 1830s, 1840s, would commission a portrait of their deceased child, and the artist would come and usually paint the child from death, but represent the child as living. So of course we've known this for a long time. They hang in museums. They're quite striking images. What nobody's really done before is looked for evidence in diaries, especially women's diaries, of their interactions with these portraits. So I found a few really amazing examples of women looking at the portraits of their deceased husbands, their deceased children, and essentially writing prayers to the dead in their journals. So addressing the dead and saying, "Dear husband, I'm looking at your portrait. It's been 7 years. I miss you so much. I will be with you shortly." So that direct address in her, so she's not vocalizing it. She's probably not speaking those words, but she's having that communication. She's maintaining a relationship with her husband, and this is 7 years after he died. So she's continuing to think about him. And so what my book is able to show in ways that historians haven't before is how people actually used these portraits. We've known that these mourning portraits have existed, but we haven't really understood as well how they figure into people's daily practice of religion.
Mm-hmm. And in your view, are these practices in any sense an appropriation of Catholic practice, or do you see them more as emerging from within a Protestant orbit?
I think that they spring from the same roots as Catholic interest in these matters. And as I argued in Death in the New World, that some, historians hate universals, and I generally am wary of universals too, but there are some things that are just, virtually universal across time and space. One of them is that that the living miss the deceased. That the death leaves a hole in individuals' feelings, in a society, and that people work to fill in that hole in some ways. So in Death in the New World, I talk about encounters between Europeans and Africans and American Indians, and they recognize the similarities, the deep similarities in mourning practices, even as details are very different. And so Catholics were responding to that human sense of loss when they responded so powerfully to purgatory. So purgatory was a doctrine that theologians worked out in kind of its full flower in the 13th century, the 12th century into the 13th century. And it became hugely popular among late medieval and early modern Catholics because it allowed people to maintain a relationship with the dead. So when Protestant reformers in the early 16th century said, no, purgatory is an invention, there's no mention of it in the Old and New Testaments, it's just, you know, something, it's Catholic propaganda, it's a way for them to sell indulgences. You know, there's then people want to maintain connection with their deceased loved ones, and other avenues present themselves. People develop other, I shouldn't phrase it so passively, people develop other avenues of maintaining those connections. So that I think that they spring from very similar roots, even as they develop in their own direction within the Protestant Atlantic world.
That makes sense. And elegies are such a good example of that, how this is being worked out even at an early stage, and then the development continues. A larger question, what do you hope readers might take away from your book?
I guess I've got two big takeaways. One is historical and one is methodological. So the historical takeaway is simply that Protestantism was a religion in which the dead played a more important role than we've really realized. That there was that sense of presence, to use Robert Orsi's phrase, the great religious scholar Robert Orsi, that sense of the presence of suprahuman beings in Protestantism other than God and Christ. So one big takeaway is a Protestantism that has this greater sense of presence, the dead, relationships between heaven and earth, that I think we've fully understood. The second big takeaway is methodological. Like I said, that if we're going to fully understand religious practice, lived religion, then we have to use a broader range of sources than sometimes we're comfortable doing, or that are the easiest ones to get online, for example. And so that'll include the material culture sources that I've been talking about, but also the diaries of women and people who are, not canonized in the long history of Protestantism. So let me just give you an example of one of my favorite ones was the spiritual journal of Sally Hersey, which is just sitting there in the Massachusetts Historical Society, where thousands of historians go and look at things. And I think that literally no one has ever used this diary, 200 pages, written in the early part of the 19th century. I've looked, I've not found it cited anywhere in any footnote, in anything. And for 200, and I can understand why. It's hard to read. And on first glance, it's boring. It's a woman kind of with her various spiritual troubles and things like that. But when you start to see patterns with other ones, and just to let her speak and listen to her, and then realize what she's doing is communicating with her dead son after 1825. Her son went away and was in North Carolina. She was in Massachusetts, and she didn't see him for 7 years and then learned he was dead. And then she writes these prayers to him year after year. After her husband dies, she writes these prayers to him as well. So the methodological point is simply to broaden out, look for sources in these places, look for these voices that haven't been given as much attention as I think they should.
It's a powerful example. Well, on behalf of the Congregational Library, thank you so much for writing this book and for giving us your time.
Thank you, Adrienne. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate it.